John Adams was an American patriot who served as the second President of the United States and the first Vice President. He was a lawyer, diplomat, statesman, political theorist, and, as a founding father, a leader of the movement for American independence from Great Britain. He was also a dedicated diarist and correspondent, particularly with his wife and closest advisor Abigail. He collaborated with his cousin, Revolutionary leader Samuel Adams, but he established his own prominence prior to the American Revolution. After the Boston Massacre, he provided a successful, though unpopular, legal defense of the accused British soldiers. In the face of severe local anti-British sentiment and driven by his devotion to the right to counsel and the protect ion of innocence, Adams was a delegate from Massachusetts to the Continental Congress, where he played a leading role in persuading Congress to declare independence. He assisted Thomas Jefferson in drafting the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and was its foremost advocate in the Congress. As a diplomat in Europe, he helped negotiate the eventual peace treaty with Great Britain, and acquired vital governmental loans from Amsterdam bankers. Adams was the primary author of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, which influenced American political theory, as did his earlier thoughts on government. Adams's credentials as a revolutionary secured for him 2 terms as President, George Washington's vice president, and also his own election in 1796 as the second president. In his single term as president, he encountered fierce criticism from the Jeffersonian Republicans, as well as the dominant faction in his own Federalist Party, led by his rival Alexander Hamilton. Adams signed the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, and built up the Army and Navy in the face of an undeclared naval Quaza War with France. The major accomplishment of his presidency was a peaceful resolution of the conflict in the face of Hamilton's opposition. Due to his strong posture on defense, Adams is often called the father of the American Navy. He was the first U.S. president to reside in the Executive Mansion, now known as the White House. In 1800, Adams lost re-election to Thomas Jefferson and retired to Massachusetts. He eventually resumed his friendship with Jefferson upon the latter's own retirement by initiating a correspondence which lasted 14 years. He and his wife established a family of politicians, diplomats, and historians now referred to as the Adams political family. Adams was the father of John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States. He died on the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, and the same day as Jefferson. Modern historians in the aggregate have favorably ranked his administration. Early life and education. Childhood. John Adams was born on October 30, 1735 to John Adams Sr. and Susanna Boylston. He had 2 younger brothers, Peter and Elihu. Though raised in modest surroundings, Adams felt an acute responsibility to live up to his family's heritage of reverence. He was a direct descendant of Puritans, who came to the American wilderness in the 1630s, established a colonial presence in America, and profoundly affected the culture, laws, and traditions of their region. Journalist Richard Brookhiser wrote that Adams' Puritan ancestors believed they lived in the Bible. England under the Stuarts was Egypt. They were Israel flying to establish a refuge for godliness, a city upon a hill. Quote, Adams, as the eldest child, was under a mandate from his parents to obtain a formal education. This began at age 6 at a dame's school for boys and girls, which was conducted at a teacher's home and centered upon the New England primer. Shortly thereafter, Adams attended Braintree Latin School under Joseph Cleverly, where studies included Latin, rhetoric, logic, and arithmetic. Adams' reflections on early education were in the negative mostly, including incidents of truancy, a dislike for his master, and a desire to become a farmer. All questions on the matter ended when his father commanded that he remain in school, saying, "You shall comply with my desires." Deacon Adams also retained a new schoolmaster named Joseph Marsh, and his son responded positively. College education and adulthood. At age 16, Adams entered Harvard College in 1751. He took all his courses under the tutorship of Joseph Mayhew, who administered his entrance exam. The French and Indian War began in 1754, and Adams began to struggle with the issue of a young man's responsibility in the conflict. Contemporaries of his social position were largely spectators, while those who were less solvent joined the battle as a means to make some money. Adams later said, "I longed more ardently to be a soldier than I ever did to be a lawyer." Quote, he was acutely aware that he was the first in his family that degenerated from the virtues of the house so far as not to have been an officer in the militia. Quote, law practice and marriage. Adams followed the usual course of reading the law in order to obtain his license to practice. In 1756, he became an apprentice in the office of John Putnam, a leading lawyer in Worcester. In 1763, he had published 7 essays in Boston newspapers, treatises that represented his forging into the convoluted realm of political theory. The essays were offered anonymously, with Adams using the nom de plume, Humphrey Plowjogger. This author reappeared in the Boston Gazette in 1765 to oppose the Stamp Act. Adams married his third cousin Abigail Smith on October 25, 1764. Her parents were Elizabeth Quincy and Rev. William Smith, a Congregational minister at Weymouth, Massachusetts. Career before the Revolution. Opponent of Stamp Act 1765. Adams first rose to prominence leading widespread opposition to the Stamp Act of 1765, imposed by the British Parliament without consulting the American legislatures, and requiring payment of a direct tax by the colonies for various stamp documents. Adams authored the Braintree Instructions in 1765, a letter sent to the representatives of Braintree in the Massachusetts legislature which served as a model for other towns' instructions. In August 1765, he reprised his pen name, Humphrey Plowjogger, and contributed 4 articles to the Boston Gazette, republished in the London Chronicle in 1768 as True Sentiments of America, also known as a dissertation on the canon and feudal law. He delivered a speech in December before the governor and council in which he pronounced the Stamp Act invalid on the ground that Massachusetts had not given its assent to it, being without representation in Parliament. He moved the family to Boston in April 1768, renting a clapboard house on Brattle Street that was known locally as the White House. Quote, he and Abigail and the children lived there for a year, then moved to Cold Lane. Still later, they moved again to a larger house in Brattle Square in the center of the city. Counsel for the British Boston Massacre. On March 5, 1770, a street confrontation resulted in British soldiers killing 5 civilians in what came to be known as the Boston Massacre. Biographer John Ferling suggests that Adams made the most of juror selection during the jury selection stage of the trial, saying that Adams expertly exercised his right to challenge individual jurors and contrived what amounted to a packed jury. Not only were several jurors closely tied through business arrangements to the British Army, but 5 ultimately became Loyalist exiles. Hilaire B. Zobel is a scholar who has closely studied the trial, and he concluded, "We can be fairly sure that before a single witness had been sworn, the outcome of the trial was certain." Ferling also surmises that Adams may have been encouraged to take the case in exchange for political office. One of Boston's seats opened 3 months later in the Massachusetts legislature. and Adams was the town's first choice to fill the vacancy. His law practice increased greatly from this exposure, as did the demands on his time. In 1771, he moved Abigail and the children to Braintree, but he kept his office in Boston, saying, "I shall spend more time in my office than ever I did." Quote, he also noted on the day of the family's move, "Now my family is away, I feel no inclination at all, no temptation, to be anywhere but at my office. I am in it by 6 in the morning. I am in it at 9 at night. In the evening, I can be alone at my office, and nowhere else. I never could in my family." Nevertheless, after some time in the capital, he became disenchanted with the rural and vulgar Braintree as a home for his family. In August 1772, therefore, Adams moved his family back to Boston. He purchased a large brick house on Queen Street, not far from his office. Objections to British Parliament's authority. Governor Thomas Hutchinson and his judges until 1772 received their salaries from the Massachusetts legislature. The Coercive Acts and the Tea Act were then passed by Parliament, and the British Crown assumed payment of those wages, drawn from customs revenues imposed upon that colony. According to biographer Furling, the British government thus singled out Massachusetts for reprisals of previous rebellion and hoped in the process to force the other colonies into line. Boston radicals protested and asked John Adams to proclaim their objections. In two replies of the Massachusetts House of Representatives to Governor Hutchinson, Adams argued that the colonists had never been under the sovereignty of Parliament. Their original charter, as well as their allegiance, was exclusively with the king. If a workable line could not be drawn between parliamentary sovereignty and the total independence of the colonies, he continued, the colonies would have no other choice but independence from England. Adams authored Nov Inglis, or A History of the Dispute with America, from its origin, in 1754, to the present time. He repudiated the essays by Daniel Leonard, which in turn defended Hutchinson's arguments for the absolute authority of Parliament over the colonies. In Nov Inglis, New Englander, Adams gave a point-by-point refutation of Leonard's essays, and then provided one of the most extensive and learned arguments made by the colonists against British imperial policy. It was a systematic attempt by Adams to describe the origins, nature, and jurisdiction of unwritten British concepts of constitutionality. Adams used his wide knowledge of English and colonial legal history to argue that the provincial legislatures were fully sovereign over their own internal affairs, and that the colonies were connected to Great Britain only through the king. The Boston Tea Party? A historic demonstration against the British enactments? Took place in December 1773. The British schooner Dartmouth, loaded with tea to be traded subject to the new tea tax, had previously dropped anchor. By 9:00 p.m. on the night of the 16th, the work of the protesters was done. They had demolished 342 chests of tea worth about £10,000. Today's equivalent of about $1 million. Adams was briefly retained by the Dartmouth owners regarding the question of their liability for the destroyed shipment. Adams applauded the destruction of the tea. There had been no choice, he thought, and he called the defiant boarding of the vessels and the quick obliteration of the dutied beverage the grandest event in the history of the colonial protest movement. He wrote the following day that the destruction of the dutied tea by the protesters had been an absolutely and indispensably necessary action. John Adams vehemently supported the right of all Americans to jury trials. Adams protested the 1765 passage of the Stamp Act, which gave jurisdiction to British Vice Admiralty courts, rather than common law courts. Member of Continental Congress. Trumbull's Declaration of Independence. Committee presents draft to Congress. Adams at center with hand on hip. Massachusetts sent Adams to the First and Second Continental Congresses in 1774 and from 1775 to 1777 respectively. The Massachusetts delegation resolved to assume a largely passive role in the First Congress, but Adams felt strongly that the conservatives of 1774, men like Joseph Galloway and James Duane, were no different than Hutchinson and Peter Oliver, and he denigrated such men, telling Abigail that spiders, toads, snakes, are their only proper emblems. Yet at that point his views were similar to those of conservative John Dickinson. He sought repeal of objectionable policies, but at the early stage he continued to see positive benefits for America remaining part of the British Empire. In 1774, as a delegate to the First Constitutional Congress. By early 1775, Adams became convinced that Congress was moving in the proper direction, away from its relationship with Great Britain. Reconciliation if practicable, he said publicly. Yet he agreed with Benjamin Franklin's confidential observation that independence was inevitable. In the fall of 1775, no one in Congress labored more ardently than Adams to hasten America's separation from Great Britain. In June 1775, with a view of promoting union among the colonies, he nominated George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of the army then assembled around Boston. His influence in Congress was great, and he then argued in favor of permanent severance from Britain. In October 1775, he was also appointed the Chief Judge of the Massachusetts Superior Court, but he never served, and resigned in February 1777. Over the next decade, Americans from every state gathered and deliberated on new governing documents, employing many of Adams' innovative positions. Prior tradition suggested that a society's form of government need not be codified in a single document, as radical as it was to write constitutions. What was equally profound was the revolutionary nature of American political thought as the summer of 1776 dawned. Thoughts on government. A number of delegates sought Adams' advice about forming new governments, and found his views so convincing they urged him to commit them to paper. He did so in separate letters to these colleagues, each missive a bit longer and more thoughtful. So impressed was Richard Henry Lee that, with Adams's consent, he had the most comprehensive letter printed, published anonymously just after mid-April 1776. It was titled simply Thoughts on Government and styled as a letter from a gentleman to his friend. Many historians agree that none of Adams' other compositions rivaled the enduring influence of this pamphlet. Adams advised that the form of government should be chosen to attain the desired ends, the happiness and virtue of the greatest number of people. He wrote that, "There is no good government but what is republican," that the only valuable part of the British Constitution is so because the very definition of a republic is an empire of laws, and not of men. The treatise also defended bicameralism, for a single assembly is liable to all the vices, follies and frailties of an individual. Declaration of Independence. Adams in the 1776 session of Congress drafted the preamble to the Lee resolution of colleague Richard Henry Lee, Virginia, which called on the colonies to adopt new independent governments. A committee of 5 was charged with drafting the declaration, and included Adams, along with Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Robert R. Livingston and Roger Sherman. Government during Revolution. After defeating the Continental Army at the Battle of Long Island on August 27, 1776, British Admiral Richard Howe mistakenly assumed a strategic advantage to be at hand, and requested the Second Continental Congress send representatives in an attempt to negotiate peace. A delegation, including Adams and Benjamin Franklin, met with Howe at the Staten Island Peace Conference on September 11. In 1777, Adams began serving as the head of the Board of War and Ordnance. In fact, he sat on no less than 90 committees, chairing 25. No other congressman approached the assumption of such a workload. As Benjamin Rush reported, he was acknowledged to be the first man in the House, quote, diplomat in Europe, commissioner to France and minister plenipotentiary. In the spring of 1776, Adams advocated in Congress that independence was necessary in order to establish trade, and conversely trade was essential for the attainment of independence. He specifically urged negotiation of a commercial treaty with France. He was then appointed, along with Franklin, Dickinson, Benjamin Harrison via Virginia and Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, to prepare a plan of treaties to be proposed to foreign powers. Indeed, while Jefferson was laboring over the Declaration of Independence, Adams worked on the model treaty. Adams joined Franklin and Arthur Lee in 1778 as a commissioner to France, replacing Silas Deane. He sailed for France with his 10-year-old son John Quincy aboard the frigate Boston early that year. Adams did not speak French, the international language of diplomacy at the time. In the fall of 1779, Adams was unanimously appointed a minister plenipotentiary, charged with negotiating a treaty of peace, amity and commerce with peace commissioners from Britain. The French foreign minister, Charles Gravier, disapproved of Adams. So Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Jay, and Henry Laurens were appointed to collaborate with Adams. Nevertheless, Jefferson did not go to Europe and Laurens was posted to the Dutch Republic. Jay, Adams, and Franklin played the major part in the final negotiations. Overruling Franklin and distrustful of Vergennes, Jay and Adams decided not to consult with France. Instead, they dealt directly with the British commissioners. Throughout the negotiations, Adams successfully demanded that the right of the United States to the fisheries along the Atlantic coast be recognized. The American negotiators were able to secure a favorable treaty securing most lands east of the Mississippi, and the document was signed on September 3, 1783. Ambassador to Holland. Medallion given to John Adams in 1782 by Johann George Holtze to mark United States as an independent nation by the Netherlands. In July 1780, Adams replaced Laurens as the ambassador to the Dutch Republic, then one of the few other republics in the world. With the aid of the Dutch patriot leader Joan van der Capellen tot den Pol, Adams secured the recognition of the United States as an independent government at The Hague on April 19, 1782. In February 1782, the Frisian States was the first Dutch province to recognize the United States, while France had been the first European country to grant diplomatic recognition in 1778. He also negotiated a loan of 5 million guilders financed by Nicholas van Staphorst and Wilhelm Willink. By 1794, a total of 11 loans were granted in Amsterdam to the United States with a value of 29 million guilders. In October 1782, he negotiated with the Dutch a treaty of amity and commerce, the first such treaty between the United States and a foreign power following the 1778 treaty with France. In 1784 and 1785, he was one of the architects of extensive trade relations between the United States and Prussia. The Prussian ambassador in The Hague, Friedrich Wilhelm von Thalmeyer, was involved, as were Jefferson and Franklin, who were in Paris. Ambassador to Great Britain. Adams was appointed in 1785 the first American minister to the court of St. James's, ambassador to Great Britain. When asked by a counterpart if he had any British relatives, Adams replied, "Neither my father or mother, grandfather or grandmother." great-grandfather or great-grandmother, nor any other relation that I know of, or care a farthing for, has been in England these 150 years. So that, you see, I have not one drop of blood in my veins but what is American. During her visit to Washington to mark the bicentennial of American independence in 1976, Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom gave historical perspective to Adams' service. John Adams, America's first ambassador, said to my ancestor, King George III, that it was his desire to help with the restoration of the old good nature and the old good humor between our peoples. That restoration has long been made, and the links of language, tradition, and personal contact have maintained it. Adams was joined by his wife while in London. They suffered the stares and hostility of the court, and chose to escape it when they could by seeking out Richard Price, minister of Newington Green Unitarian Church and instigator of the Revolution controversy. Conceptions of constitutional government. Adams' preoccupation with political and governmental affairs, which caused considerable separation from his wife and children, ironically had a distinct familial context, which he articulated in 1780. I must study politics and war that my sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce and agriculture, in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. Quote, the Massachusetts Constitution of that year, to which Adams was a primary contributor, structured its government closely on his views of politics and society. In 1779, he drafted the document together with Samuel Adams and James Bowdoin. While in London, Adams published a work entitled A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States. Wood has maintained that Adams' political philosophy had become irrelevant by the time the federal Constitution was ratified. By then, American political thought, transformed by more than a decade of vigorous debate as well as formative experiential pressures, had abandoned the classical perception of politics as a mirror of socialist states. Americans' new understanding of popular sovereignty was that the citizenry were the sole possessors of power in the nation. Representatives in the government enjoyed mere portions of the people's power and only for a limited time. Adams was thought to have overlooked this evolution and revealed his continued attachment to the older version of politics. Adams was unsurpassed in his dedication to establishing checks and balances as a governing stratagem. On the government's role in education, Adams offered unambiguously that the whole people must take upon themselves the education of the whole people and be willing to bear the expenses of it. There should not be a district of 1 mile square without a school in it, not founded by a charitable individual, but maintained at the public expense of the people themselves. Vice Presidency, 1789–96. When Washington won the presidential election of 1789 with 69 votes in the Electoral College, Adams came in second with 34 votes and became vice president. In that capacity, he became under the Constitution the President of the United States Senate. Due to a delay in the decision of the Electoral College, Adams first presided over the Senate on April 21. Washington was officially sworn in and gave his inaugural address on April 30. Beyond Adams' nominal position in the Senate, he was allowed a vote as a tiebreaker when required. He otherwise played a minor role in the politics of the early 1790s. He was re-elected vice president in 1792. Washington seldom asked Adams for advice on policy and legal issues during his tenure as vice president. At the start of Washington's administration, Adams became deeply involved in a month-long Senate controversy over the official title of the President. Adams favored grandiose titles derived from British Crown tradition, such as His Majesty the President or His High Mightiness, the President of the United States and protector of their liberties. Jefferson described Adams' proposed titles as superlatively ridiculous. Quote, "As President of the Senate, Adams cast a historic 31 tie-breaking votes. He thus protected the President's sole authority over the removal of appointees and influenced the location of the nation's capital." But his views did not always align with Washington, who joined Franklin as the object of Adams' ire. As shown in this quote, "The history of our revolution will be one continued lie. The essence of the whole will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and outsprung General Washington. That Franklin electrified him with his rod, and henceforth these two conducted all the policy, negotiations, legislatures and war. On at least one occasion, he persuaded senators to vote against legislation that he opposed, and he frequently lectured the Senate on procedural and policy matters." Adams' political views and his attempt to assume a more active role in the Senate made him a natural target for critics of the Washington administration. Toward the end of his first term, as a result of a threatened resolution that would have silenced him except for procedural and policy matters, he began to exercise more restraint. When the nation's first two opposing political parties formed, he joined the Federalist Party, though he was consistently in opposition to its dominant leader Alexander Hamilton. Adams' 2 terms as vice president were a frustrating experience for him. He complained to his wife Abigail, "My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Quote, Presidential election of 1796. The 1796 election was the premier contest under the first-party system. Adams was the presumptive presidential nominee of the Federalist Party. The other Federalist candidate was Thomas Pinckney, the governor of South Carolina, considered electable as the vice president. At that time, there was no formal practice of naming a vice presidential nominee. The result was left to the Electoral College in determining the vice president as the second-place winner of electoral votes. Adams and Pinckney's opponents, of the Democratic-Republican Party, were former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who was joined by Senator Aaron Burr of New York as the party's second nominee. Many Federalists would have preferred Hamilton to be a candidate, although Hamilton supported Adams. His more austere background made him somewhat resentful. Some suspected Hamilton of supporting Pinckney over Adams, though this was later demonstrated to be false. Hamilton was more determined to defeat Jefferson. Hamilton and his supporters did, however, believe that Adams lacked the seriousness and popularity that had caused Washington to be successful, and feared that Adams was too vain, opinionated, unpredictable and stubborn to follow their directions. Burr was the only active campaigner in the group. In keeping with the current practice, Adams stayed in his hometown, as did the others, rather than actively campaign for the presidency. He specifically stated that he wanted to stay out of what he called the silly and wicked game of campaigning for office. The Federalist Party, however, campaigned for him, while the Democratic Republicans campaigned for Jefferson. It was expected that Adams would dominate the votes in New England, while Jefferson was expected to win the southern states. In the end, Adams won the election by a narrow margin of 71 electoral votes to 68 for Jefferson, who became the vice president. Adams's vote totals included one crucial vote from Jefferson's own Virginia and also one from North Carolina. Presidency, 1797 to 1801. President's House, Philadelphia. Adams occupied this Philadelphia mansion from March 1797 to May 1800. Adams followed Washington's lead in using the presidency to exemplify Republican values and civic virtue, and his service was free of scandal. He continued to strengthen the central government by expanding the Navy and Army. In July 1798, Adams signed into law the Act for the Relief of Sick and Disabled Seamen, which authorized the establishment of a government-operated marine hospital service. Historians debate his decision to retain en masse the members of Washington's cabinet. Many felt he was oblivious to the political danger of such a decision. In light of the cabinet's loyalty to Hamilton, the Hamiltonians who surround him, Jefferson soon remarked, "You are only a little less hostile to him than to me." Quote, historian George Herring argues that Adams was the most independent-minded of the founders. Quaza War and peace with France. The president's term was marked by disputes concerning the country's role, if any, in the expanding conflict in Europe, where Britain and France were at war. Hamilton and the Federalists supported Britain, while Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans favored France. Sentiments changed with the XYZ affair, in which the French demanded huge bribes before any discussions could begin regarding American complaints. This substantially weakened popular American support of France. The pro-French Jeffersonians lost support and quickly became the minority as many began to demand full-scale war. The affair heightened fears of sedition by the administration's opponents, and legislation was introduced in response. The president knew that America would be unable to win a conflict, as France at the time was dominating the fight in most of Europe. Adams therefore pursued a strategy whereby American ships harassed French ships in an effort sufficient to stem the French assaults on American interests. This was the undeclared naval war between the U.S. and France, the Quaza War, which broke out in 1798. There was danger of invasion from the more powerful French forces, so Adams and the Federalist Congress built up the army, bringing back Washington as its commander. Washington wanted Hamilton to be his second in command, and Adams reluctantly accommodated. Adams also rebuilt the Navy, adding 6 fast, powerful frigates, most notably the USS Constitution, to pay for the military buildup. Congress imposed new taxes on property, the direct tax of 1798. Hamilton assumed control in the War Department, and the rift between Adams and Hamilton's supporters widened. Many sought to vest Hamilton with command authority over the army, and they also resisted giving prominent Democratic Republicans positions in the army, which Adams wanted to do in order to gain bipartisan support. By building a large standing army, Hamilton's supporters raised popular alarms and played into the hands of the Democratic Republicans. They also alienated Adams and his large personal following. They short-sightedly viewed the Federalist Party as their own tool and ignored the need to pull together the entire nation in the face of war with France. Overall, however, patriotic sentiments and a series of naval victories popularized the war as well as the president. In February 1799, Adams surprised many by sending diplomat William Vans Murray on a peace mission to France. Napoleon, realizing that the conflict was pointless, signaled his readiness for friendly relations. At the Convention of 1800, the Treaty of Alliance of 1778 was superseded, and the United States was then free of foreign entanglements. As Washington had advised in his farewell address, Adams brought in John Marshall as Secretary of State and demobilized the emergency army. Alien and Sedition Acts. Despite the discredit of the XYZ affair, the Democratic-Republicans' opposition persisted. In the midst of war, which included the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, political tensions were incendiary. Some pro-French Democratic Republicans even fostered a movement in America, similar to the French Revolution, to overthrow the Federalists. Congress specifically passed 4 measures. The Naturalization Act, the Alien Friends Act, the Alien Enemies Act and the Sedition Act. These statutes were designed to mitigate the threat of secessionists by disallowing their most extreme firebrands. The Naturalization Act increased to 14 years the period of residence required for an immigrant to attain American citizenship. Naturalized citizens tended to vote for the Democratic Republicans. The Alien Friends Act and the Alien Enemies Act allowed the president to deport any foreigner from friendly and hostile nations, respectively, which he considered dangerous to the country. The Sedition Act made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or its officials. Punishments included 2 to 5 years in prison and fines of up to $5. Although Adams had not promoted any of these acts, he signed them into law. The acts became controversial from prosecution thereunder of a congressman and a number of newspaper editors. Indeed, the Federalist administration initiated 14 or more indictments under the Sedition Act, as well as suits against 5 of the 6 most prominent Democratic-Republican newspapers. The majority of the legal actions began in 1798 and 1799, and went to trial on the eve of the 1800 presidential election, timing that hardly appeared coincidental. According to biographer Furling, other historians have cited evidence that the Alien and Sedition Acts were rarely enforced. Namely, 1. Only 10 convictions under the Sedition Act have been identified. 2. Adams never signed a deportation order. And 3. The sources have expressed furor over the acts were Democratic Republicans. However, other historians have emphasized that the acts were employed for political targeting from the outset, causing many aliens to leave the country. The acts as well allowed for prosecution of many who opposed the Federalists, even on the floor of Congress. Election of 1800. The death of Washington in 1799 weakened the Federalists, as they lost the one man who united the party. In the presidential election of 1800, Adams and his fellow Federalist candidate, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, opposed the Republican ticket of Jefferson and Burr. Hamilton tried his hardest to sabotage Adams' campaign in the hope of boosting Pinckney's chances of winning the presidency. In the end, Adams lost narrowly to Jefferson by 65 to 73 electoral votes, with New York providing the decisive margin. Adams' defeat resulted from 1. The stronger organization of the Democratic Republicans. 2. Federalist disunity. 3. The controversy of the Alien and Sedition Acts. 4. The popularity of Jefferson in the South. And 5. The effective politicking of Aaron Burr in New York State, where the legislature shifted from Federalist to Democratic-Republican on the basis of a few wards in New York City controlled by Burr's machine. In the closing months of his term, Adams became the first president to occupy the new, but unfinished, President's Mansion, later known as the White House, beginning November 1, 1800. After his defeat in the hotly contested election, Adams was depressed when he left office. His son Charles had also recently died from alcoholism, and he was anxious to rejoin his wife Abigail, who had left for Massachusetts months before the inauguration. As a result, he did not attend Jefferson's inauguration, departing the White House at 4:00 a.m. that day, and making him one of only 4 presidents surviving in office not to attend his successor's inauguration. Adams' correspondence with Jefferson at the time is not indicative of the animosity and resentment that scholars have attributed to him. Administration and Cabinet. Judicial appointments. Supreme Court. Adams named John Marshall as the 4th Chief Justice of the United States to succeed Oliver Ellsworth, who had retired due to ill health. Marshall's long tenure represents the most lasting influence of the Federalists as he infused the Constitution with a judicious and carefully reasoned nationalistic interpretation and established the judicial branch as the equal of the executive and legislative branches. Other judicial appointments. The lame duck session of Congress in late 1800 enacted the Judiciary Act of 1801, which created a set of federal appeals courts between the district courts and the Supreme Court. The purpose of the statute was twofold. First, to remedy the defects in the federal judicial system inherent in the Judiciary Act of 1789, and second, to enable the defeated Federalists to staff the new judicial offices with loyal Federalists in the face of the party's defeat in 1800. The party had lost control of both houses of Congress in addition to the White House. Retirement. Adams resumed farming at his home Peacefield in the town of Quincy. He also began work on an autobiography, which he never finished, and resumed correspondence with such old friends as Benjamin Waterhouse and Benjamin Rush. After Jefferson's retirement from public life in 1809, Adams became more vocal. He published a 3-year marathon of letters in the Boston Patriot newspaper, refuting line by line an 1800 pamphlet by Hamilton which attacked his conduct and character. Though Hamilton had died in 1804 in a duel with Aaron Burr, Adams felt the need to vindicate his character against the New Yorker's vehement charges. The years of retirement in the Adams household were not without some temporary financial adversity. In 1803, the bank holding his cash reserves of about $13,000 collapsed. Son John Quincy came to the rescue by purchasing from him his properties in Weymouth and Quincy, including Peacefield, for the sum of $12,800. Daughter Abigail, Nabby, was married to Representative William Stephen Smith, but she returned to her parents' home after the failure of the marriage. She died of breast cancer in 1813. His wife Abigail died of typhoid on October 28, 1818. His son Thomas and wife Anne, along with 7 children, lived with Adams to the end of Adams' life, as well as Louisa Smith, Abigail's niece by her brother William. Correspondence with Jefferson. John Adams was nearly 89 when, at the request of his son, John Quincy Adams, he posed a final time for Gilbert Stuart. In early 1812, Adams reconciled with Jefferson. Their mutual friend Benjamin Rush, a fellow signer of the Declaration of Independence who had been corresponding with both, encouraged them to reach out to the other. On New Year's Day, Adams sent a brief, friendly note to Jefferson to accompany the delivery of 2 pieces of homespun, a 2-volume collection of lectures on rhetoric by John Quincy Adams. Jefferson replied immediately with a cordial letter, and the 2 men revived their friendship, which they sustained by mail. The correspondence that they resumed in 1812 lasted the rest of their lives, and has been hailed as among their great legacies of American literature. Their letters represent an insight into both the period and the minds of the 2 revolutionary leaders and presidents. The missives lasted 14 years, and consisted of 158 letters, 109 from Adams and 49 from Jefferson. Death. Tombs of John Adams, far, and John Quincy Adams, near, in family crypt at United First Parish Church. Less than a month before his death, Adams issued a statement about the destiny of the United States, which historians such as Joy Hakim have characterized as a warning for his fellow citizens. My best wishes, in the joys and festivities, and the solemn services of that day on which will be completed the 50th year from its birth, of the independence of the United States, a memorable epoch in the annals of the human race, destined in future history to form the brightest or the blackest page, according to the use or the abuse of those political institutions by which they shall, in time to come, be shaped by the human mind. Quote, on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Adams died at his home in Quincy at approximately 6:20 p.m. Political philosophy and views. Slavery. Adams never bought a slave and declined on principle to utilize slave labor, saying, "I have, through my whole life, held the practice of slavery in such abhorrence, that I have never owned a Negro or any other slave, though I have lived for many years in times when the practice was not disgraceful, when the best men in my vicinity thought it not inconsistent with their character, and when it has cost me thousands of dollars for the labor and subsistence of free men, which I might have saved by the purchase of Negroes at times when they were very cheap." Quote. Accusations of monarchism. Throughout his lifetime, Adams expressed controversial and shifting views regarding the virtues of monarchical and hereditary political institutions. Many of these attacks are considered to have been scurrilous, including suggestions that he was planning to crown himself king and grooming John Quincy as heir to the throne. Religious views. Adams was raised a Congregationalist, since his ancestors were Puritans. According to biographer McCullough, as his family and friends knew, Adams was both a devout Christian and an independent thinker. Fraser notes that while Adams shared many perspectives with deists, Adams clearly was not a deist. Deism rejected any and all supernatural activity and intervention by God. Consequently, deists did not believe in miracles or God's providence. Adams, however, did believe in miracles, providence, and, to a certain extent, the Bible as revelation. Quote. Biographies. Adams' grandson Charles Francis Adams, Sr., edited the first 2 volumes of the works of John Adams, ESQ, second President of the United States. This was published between 1850 and 1856 by Charles C. Little and James Brown in Boston. The first 7 chapters were produced by Adams' son John Quincy Adams. The premier modern biography was Honest John Adams, a 1933 biography by the noted French specialist in American history Gilbert Chinard, who came to Adams after writing his acclaimed 1929 biography of Thomas Jefferson. For a generation, Chinard's work was regarded as the best life of Adams, and it is still an important text in illustrating the themes of Adams' biographical and historical scholarship. Following the opening of the Adams Family Papers in the 1950s, Page Smith published the first major biography to use these previously inaccessible primary sources. His biography won a 1962 Bancroft Prize but was criticized for its scanting of Adams' intellectual life and its diffuseness. In 1975, Peter Shaw published The Character of John Adams, a thematic biography noted for its psychological insight into Adams' life. The 1992 character study by Joseph J. Ellis, Passionate Sage, The Character and Legacy of John Adams, was Ellis's first major publishing success and remains one of the most useful and insightful studies of Adams' personality. In 1992, the Revolutionary War historian and biographer John E. Ferling published his acclaimed John Adams, A Life, also noted for its psychological sensitivity. In 2001, historian David McCullough published a biography entitled John Adams that won various awards. McCullough's biography was the basis for a 2008 TV miniseries,